Hey, what's up, guys? Node Investor here. Hope everyone is doing well on this post-halving, what day is it? Thursday, maybe Friday by the time you're listening to this. Some of you guys, it's probably already Friday. Thanks for being here. What's going on here? It's been pretty volatile, kind of heading up to the halving. No surprise there. We saw the post-halving dump this past weekend. I caught a little short hedge on that. Bought the dip and still holding BTC. But now that we're approaching resistance, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out here. So I'm going to go into some thoughts there. I don't have any alt trades open at the time. It's just been the BTC story for me, which has been easy and really kind of just been the better play at this point in terms of trying to guess this market. But we'll see how this thing plays out here near term. I'm going to go over the Bitcoin dominance chart, as you can see right here, as well as the big cap names, and we'll kind of limit this to, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes or so. We'll see how it goes, and then I'll let you guys pick anything you guys want to look at for now. But man, oh man, never a dull moment in the markets here. Before we go into crypto, right, I'm looking at BTC here. I'm going to go over to the stock market because the stock market starting to look like it wants to top here. Now today's bouncing, had this very bullish reversal in terms of the daily chart, right? You undercut the lows, you had this washout and popping. And this is the SPY, the S&P 500 ETF. But we've been having this nice little bounce post Corona crash, panic. And as we know, most of the markets have been bouncing, right? It's just kind of been moving up in tandem, right? That's kind of been the big thing. And we're looking for that decoupling, right? When does crypto and some of these other markets start to decouple? Perhaps stocks pull back and crypto continues to grind its way higher, especially in light of all the quantitative easing. But this is what I'm looking at right now on the S&P. Some near-term targets to be watching is this broader resistance here on the way down. If it starts to pull back, we're going to want to look at around that 260, right? It's going to be interesting to see if we do see stocks break below that mark, what happens to the crypto markets? Do they follow suit, or do we finally see that decoupling? And then, of course, you've got several levels down from there. If you caught the last update I did here, and as well as the most recent podcast or interview I did with Crush the Street, I was talking about my expectations for stocks. In summary, right, I don't think that low that we saw in March was the low, personally. That's just my opinion. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope things kind of get back to normal and things start to play out a little bit more positively. But personally, I just don't see that happening. And I expect that more likely than not, it'll just kind of be this slow grind down, right, over the coming months. And then at some point, if people start to look at that, starting to play out and think, oh, this thing has where to go, then what'll happen is you'll get that capitulation drop, and then it'll be kind of that big sharp drop towards the lows, and perhaps that starts to mark a little bit more of a near-term bottom, and then we go from there. That's kind of my expectation. I don't necessarily see us kind of doing one of these straight down from here again. I think it'll be more of a back and forth, but over the longer period, just kind of the slow grind lower, which ultimately undercuts the March lows. Now, in light of that, right, what happens to the crypto space? Do they just totally buck the trend, or do they also see, of kind of sideways actions that ultimately cuts low? Personally, I'm thinking we're starting to buck the trend, and we will see those two not trade in tandem as much anymore. Near term, it's kind of anyone's guess, and personally, I think we're due for a little bit of a pullback here. I'd like to see a pause, a breather to digest this bigger move that we saw leading into the halving, right? We had this huge bounce off the lows, which completely negated the Corona panic dump, essentially retested some of the most recent highs leading up to that, right? The February price point that we were trading around. And so that was a tremendous bounce. It just kind of stair-stepped, pause. Now that the halving is behind us, this, I believe, was partly pricing that in, right? We saw that quick, profit taking right into that weekend, and I think that was just trying to shake some people out. It was a lot of back and forth, and then the day came, and it was, kind of uneventful. The price had already pulled back some, and a little bit of a bounce into that. Now, keep in mind, longer term, yeah, I'm still bullish longer term Bitcoin, and I think this is actually quite positive. The halving is going to be bullish for it. Supply, demand, structure, all that, as I continue to say here. But we're still within this broader pattern, but we are potentially trying to break out of here finally. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Do we get a pullback on the weekly? I think we need it personally. But do we get that pullback on the weekly and then launch from there? Or does it just kind of sit tight here and then finally just pops right through, and then we get the the retest and then the get go? So those are the two things that I'm watching here in the big picture as far as Bitcoin prices. Now, the 10K number, psychologically, it's just a big round number. We've traded in and around those levels for several times here in the past, in the recent past especially. But it's important to keep in mind that in the history of Bitcoin, right, the amount of time spent trading over 10K is relatively small, right? It's something like 6 months of the total life of Bitcoin is traded over that period in terms of number of days, right? So it's not that it's going to never trade above that, but when it finally starts to hold above that level, I think it's going to be a significant event, especially considering this bigger picture consolidation that we've seen play out, right? The first time it traded above 10K, I mean, yeah, that was at the top of a parabolic move and ultimately broke back below. And then last year we saw it get back above, also at the top of a pretty much parabolic move, right? We went from 3K to 14K, and it just kind of started to chop around, but then eventually broke back below. And then here recently, we've seen several attempts at it again, but all of them have been met with some resistance. And so what I'd like to see here is a little bit of a pause just below this 10K or in and around this 10K, and let these moving averages start to catch up some more. And then that would really set up a base from which you can see that breakout take place. And then in that scenario, I'm thinking 12K is your next big target. And then after that, personally, all-time highs would be my next target after 12K. So that's what I'm looking at. If you look at the 2019 prices, right, on a weekly basis, price never closed above 12K. I mean, it wicked above for a few days, but on a weekly basis, there was never a close above 11.7, right? So something to make note of, right? And that's the next big target. So if we go to the daily chart here real quick, looking at this, could this be a little double top in the formation happening? It could be. Certainly worth noting there, right? If you get a pullback and it starts to break below 8,200, then you could see a pretty quick spike lower. If it holds above that, then you could start to see that consolidation that I'm hoping for, right? That little bit of a base building in and around this zone, from which you could see a pretty nice launch over 10K. So a couple of ways I'm playing this right now. I'm still long Bitcoin, but I'm starting to hedge right now. I'm just hedging with some very low margin type of hedges, and really just kind of more of a wait and see. Mostly because I don't necessarily want to get out of BTC, particularly because in the event of a breakthrough, you could see a pretty quick spike higher. So I want to maintain my exposure from that perspective. But in the event we start to roll over, I'll start to pile on the hedge, and it'll more than offset, especially if I start using more leverage. It'll more than offset some of that. My plan being closing out the shorts into the dip and basically rolling those profits back into BTC to add to the long exposure. At some point, however, we want to also start looking at the altcoin market. Right now, it's mostly been the Bitcoin game. Going back to the BTC dominance chart here real quick, it's very evident. You can see Bitcoin has been outperforming for the most part, right? You had that nice rally in the pullback, a little bit of a mini alt rally there. And pretty much since end of April, you've just been in this BTC dominant mode, and that's clear when you look at most of the altcoin pairs, right? In the BTC pairs, here's EOS BTC, not a pretty sight. Here's ETH BTC. We covered this one here after rolling over from this little base up here, couldn't break through. It's pretty much been just kind of the drop. But at some point, right, when do we see that rotation start to take place? And I think it's going to be hit or miss. There's going to always be alts rallying. I mean, there's just always going to be something there. But I like to weigh my bets in favor of what's the dominant trend. Right now, the dominant trend is Bitcoin's outperforming alts. by a large margin, right, across the board. And so right now I'm just preferring to stay with the larger BTC exposure, knowing that, yeah, there's always some alts that are going to rally. Maybe, slowly start moving into that when I see more and more bucking the trend, and then I get more aggressive there. But for now, until that changes, I'm still kind of just preferring BTC. But a lot of these alts, no doubt, are hitting these oversold conditions. I mean, there's a lot of big drops on the daily charts and the weekly charts. They're oversold on the daily charts. If you have some patience, might not be a bad place to start looking at some of these here and slowly accumulating at that point. I'm not doing that quite yet, but I'm certainly paying attention to some of those extremely oversold names, especially in big cap land, things like EOS, Litecoin. ETH is not quite there. I'm going to keep an eye on ETH here to see if it can break below this little neckline right there. If it does, then I'll start looking for some of those deeply oversold spikes to potentially roll some BTC over into some of these names. But for now, still kind of just long BTC and starting to hedge a little bit on the downside. If we go to that 4-hour chart, you can see we had that big spike down here into the weekend, leading into the halving. Got pretty choppy, but it made for a good bounce trade here, place to reaccumulate, and now we're retesting that same zone. The question is, do we get a pullback? Short term, I'm thinking we probably will. How deep of a pullback is that? Is it just kind of the grind and starts to chop around here, or is it the big spike that creates a weekly pullback? That's yet to be seen. I'm prepared for either way, and that's just the way I'm looking at it right now. In terms of the big picture scenario, but longer term, still bullish, still macro picture. BTC I think will do well. If I had to pick, I'd pick BTC over stocks at this point, but to each his own. So let's go look at the metrics real quick here, looking at the Bitcoin dominance, the BMI values here, still reading bullish here. It has gone back and forth. The daily bot strategy finally went flat after the shakeout over the weekend, and it's still reading flat at this point, but I noticed that the 4-hour chart, or the 4-hour bot, has been a little bit choppy lately. It's kind of been long, flat. That's not surprising considering the little volatility that we saw here. Go back to that 4-hour chart, right? The volatility that we've been seeing here over the last couple of days leading into the halving and just post-halving. So the bots are, feeling a little bit of the whipsaw here, but all in all, still bullish. If you look at the broader trend, the daily moving averages are moving higher. They're holding. That pullback held at the 22 daily EMA on the closing basis. And so from that perspective, the trend is your friend. I was making note of this high RSI on the daily. I know there was a lot of FOMO heading into the halving, but just as a rule of thumb, right? Like me personally, if I want to add into a position, or if I'm getting the FOMO, if the daily BMI or the daily RSI is 80 or higher, I'm just going to wait for either a flat consolidation or a pullback, because odds favor you're going to get some sort of pullback when the RSI starts to poke above that. Where that pullback happens is anyone's guess, but you could get that price spike, but it's just from a risk reward perspective, you're much better off looking at these oversold conditions or looking at pullbacks along the way than FOMOing into an RSI that's way overextended after it's come up from from 4K, 5K up to almost 10K. I mean, just my rule of thumb. You don't have to do it that way, but it just makes sense to kind of put the risk reward in your favor. And we saw this pullback, brought the RSI back down to 50. That made sense to start just looking at some longs at that point. But do we get that pullback, the bigger, deeper pullback? On the weekly chart, RSI has plenty of room to run, which is why I'd like to see a little bit of a consolidation here and then break through. It's right at that 60 mark, which, if you follow the ABCs of RSI rules, that tends to be a little bit of a wall when things are in bear mode. But if it turns into bull mode, you're going to see it finally break through that 60 mark. So that's what we're anticipating here. Again, on the upside, starting to get over that 10.5 level. Next target up is about 12K. So that'd be a nice little move. If it starts to stall out here, then on the way down, look at around 8K as your first big support level. And then, a lot of places along the way between there. if we get a deeper retracement on the Bitcoin price on the weekly chart, just doing some simple fib levels, 7,600 would be a level to be watching there on the fib retracement levels, and then 6,900. Do we get that far down? Who knows? I personally don't think so. I think there's a lot of people on the sidelines that would be buying well above this point. But hey, this is crypto, right? Anything can happen. All right, so let's see what we got here. So that's the big picture view there on BTC here. We covered the BTC dominance chart. Let's pop back over to that real quick here, looking at that BTC dominance. It popped over the 68 mark after bouncing and pulling back up here, hit 69, and now it's kind of holding its own, but it's still trending higher. And so what I'm going to be doing is just keeping an eye on those bigger cap alts, things like EOS, Litecoin, Ethereum. You know, those have been the somewhat leaders in terms of when the Bitcoin dominance starts to reverse. Bitcoin Cash, XRP really haven't, even though they carry a lot of weight from the dominance chart perspective. So those are not the ones I'm typically watching right now. If you go to XRP, you know, it's just not really been the harbinger here in terms of showing that early move. Things like ETH and EOS have been better, so that's what I'm going to be watching. There's a handful of other names you could watch that have been somewhat leaders here, things like Link, Tezos, right, in terms of some of that reversal there, so certainly something to keep an eye on. But looking at things like XTZ, right, it had this big top, rallied right to the target. I mean, almost perfectly. That was a great trade, by the way. Just when you finally saw that pop break above the trend line, I mean, it went almost right to the target exactly before rolling over. Now the question is, does it break below this neckline here? My bet is it's going to probably at least test that. That's around that 2,400 level. Below that, it's anyone's guess. What I'd like to see, if I wanted to go long on this guy versus Bitcoin, I'd like to see it break below and then very quickly get back above, and that'd signify a potential shakeout. But it still needs to get above the daily 10 EMA at minimum, in my opinion. Right now, the trend is still very much not your friend, and until that ends, you know, just take some patience there. XRP, no love for the XRP. EOS, I'm keeping an eye on. EOS is generally a good trade for me. I like to trade EOS back and forth between this one. It's had quite the drop here as of late, undercutting. If you look at the weekly chart, I mean, this is breaking into new low grounds after breaking this multi-month support. So one I'm keeping an eye on to see if it can bounce back quickly. If it can and get back above the line, and the line that I'm talking about is essentially this support that it's busted below. If it can quickly get back above that and start to hold, then I'm going to start looking at potentially a reversal trade there in terms of bouncing back versus BTC. It is oversold, but just because it's oversold doesn't mean it's got to bounce. Just keep that in mind for the knife catchers. The knife catching. I know there's a lot of knife catchers here in this industry. What are some of the other? Let's go look at some of the other names here. I'm going to go to the bot status here real quick. This is just alphabetical, big cap names, and you can see it's a lot of red across the board. And what this signifies is what's the trading pair, right? So alt BTC pairs, and this is the bull momentum index relative to BTC. So in a nutshell, it just means that the alts are underperforming Bitcoin. And then we saw that very clearly, right? So the trading bot, for the most part, is either short or flat. There's one that it's long on the daily still, but it's flat on the 4-hour. That's Neo. We'll go look at that one here. But everything else has gone back to flat. Cardano was the other one that was at some point outperforming, but even the bot status has gone flat on that one for both the daily and the 4-hour chart. So I want to see some of these names start popping back up and reversing before I start to get too aggressive here on the knife catching. You don't have to get the first movers all the time, right? There's always going to be movers, but when you start to see the trend and more names start to move in tandem, then maybe it's time. I don't think it's time just yet, but hopefully we'll start to see that soon. If Bitcoin goes into one of these consolidations where it starts to just build a little bit of a range in here, then my expectation is the alts will have a nice little rally. Even if it's a mini rally, which only lasts a week or two, then that's my expectation, that if Bitcoin starts to hold and not just completely dump, but just go flat for a while, choppy, then I think there'll be some good alt trades. That may be the way to go at that point. All right, let's see here. Thank you for the likes. Thanks for watching. What is going on here else? What else is trending here? Let me see. Omise Go, I saw that one popping up earlier. ENG, Energy, a bunch of small cap names. Phantom, oh my god, a name from yesteryear. Dragon, let's see, Ito, Zill. So I saw Zill broke above some resistance, as did Theta. Let's go look at a handful of those names here. So I'm going to start with OMG, and I'm going to go BTC pair. OMG BTC pair popping up on the trending list here today. A lot of volume coming off the lows. I'm not following this one lately, so I don't know if it's just another pump and you know what else follows, but or if it's something else. But in this space, you know, try not to FOMO into those moves, guys. I mean, look at 0x, right? Like, you're gonna get dumped on if you buy the tops. I mean, just wait for a pullback. I mean, look at the daily chart of 0x. Unless you caught it early on in the move and banked it, it's pretty risky to FOMO into those. At this point, now, if I really wanted it, it would make more sense to start looking at it now that it's pulled back to the moving averages on the daily chart. But when it's way up here and the RSI is already at 85, I mean, you missed it, right? Like, you missed it. Let it go. So now, potentially moving back. So just keep that in mind. Now, OMG, this one is breaking above some resistance from the last month and a half, so maybe it gets going again. There's a ton of volume on that move, which is always good. We'll see if that can sustain. If it does, then the targets I'd be looking at are here and here as far as your next big target. So what is that? 1180 and around 1300 or so. Looking at the Zill. Zill finally maybe breaking through. If you zoom out, it doesn't look like a big move. It's come a long ways from the top, but if you zoom in here, this is a long time resistance level. I mean, this goes back to August of 2019. It's had multiple attempts at this level, and it's finally maybe gonna start moving past it here. That'd be good. That'd really start to signify a long-term trend change, maybe at least for the near term, right? But longer-term bottom being established here on Zill. Next target up is around 120 sats and then 160. But as always, you know, pick your entry points with these guys. They're pretty volatile. Good chance you're going to get a little wick to the downside. Let's go look at NEO, because NEO was the only one where the bot status still said long versus Bitcoin. I don't know. I mean, it's not necessarily outperforming BTC, but, you know, for the last, what, 7-8 months, you know, it's been relatively on par with Bitcoin. I mean, it moved out of range here, but it was dropping below. But even since March, it's at least held up okay. But if I'm just looking at this chart, particularly, it's not that bullish, and here's why. You had this break below range right here, and it's bouncing right into that, and it's starting to pull back from it, and there's a good chance it's going to finally crack below that 987 level. So what I want to see, right, if I wanted to go long on this, I'd probably just wait for that 1200 level to break, because, you know, that 987 goes back quite some ways, that 1000 sat level, if you want to call it that. Getting back over this 1180 would really start to look positive and start to show some outperformance. Right now, it's just kind of range bound, in my opinion. In addition to BTC, what are some of the core long-term names you're acquiring? From a long-term, meaning like not trading stuff, BTC is probably the primary right now. I'm still not expecting ETH or any of those big cap names to go away, and I think they're pretty decent. I haven't added any more recently. I did buy some ETH during the massive dump. I was a bit early. I think I started scooping it up at 130, and then I added at 120, and then it went down to sub 100, and I should have waited till then. But you know, looking back now, it's fine, right? I mean, it's back over, you know, 140 easily. So ETH was the only one that I added in terms of the longer term stuff, and Bitcoin. Not too inclined to get too aggressive in terms of new additions to anything else at this point, until we see what happens with, you know, now that we're post-halving, maybe time to start reassessing some of that. But I think Bitcoin is just, it's getting a lot of mainstream attention, right? It's still kind of the big name. So what you could see is Bitcoin have that big spike on the dominance chart again. If it starts to break over that 70 mark, it's going to be a big move, and that just won't be pretty for the alts, right? So I'm still more inclined to be BTC centric until we get a clear pullback in the dominance and some of those alts start to turn. Even like I said, even if you miss the exact bottom in the alt cycle, like who cares, right? Because we're talking weekly charts here. And yeah, they're kind of bouncing around. They could break lower. But if they finally get going, I mean, if things really start to move, okay, you missed the first 20, 30%. Like, no big deal. Because if it really is an alt cycle, you're going to catch the next, 40, 50%, or maybe even more, double, right? And at that point, it makes more sense to wait. There's no clear change in the altcoin BTC pair structures just yet. Other than these good tradable short-term rallies, you're not getting that massive macro picture. I mean, look at these weekly charts. They dropped. They had a really good chance to do it right here and get going, and then they gave it up. So until that changes, you got to be cautious. Again, that's longer term thinking. Trading, totally different, right? I have no problem going into an altcoin trade for a few days or a few weeks even, knowing that, I'm going to just book it. So totally different. But in terms of just kind of locking stuff away and forgetting about it for a few months, BTC is still kind of my choice right now. All right, let's see what else we have here. How long have I been going here? Look at my timer here. All right, so I'll go for about another 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up here. So let's look at a few names here. Matic. So Matic had that nice little pop here a few days ago. 2 days of green, pulling right back right now. Let's go to that 4-hour chart here. I'd be watching it right here if you were liking it. See if it holds up above this moving average. You don't want to necessarily see it go too much lower. If it starts to lose, that 190 level, probably the end of the move, especially the daily chart. But holding above that would be good, because that'd be a retest of this breakout point. That'd be slightly below those moving averages, but it'd still be right at the daily 10 EMA. So that's where I'd be watching it if you wanted to see a pullback, and I'd like to see a pullback hold there at that level. If it starts to hold there, Matic's a tough one though. I mean, this is notoriously choppy, and it has those big moves up, big moves down. So with that in mind, right, it's very tough to trade this one. But if it starts to bounce here, obviously getting above yesterday's highs, then I'd be looking at around 240 to 260 as your next target on that one. So could be a decent trade, but Matic's a tough one for me. BTC on the move. Let's go see the Bitcoin here. Oh yeah, 9,800. There we go. Can we break 10K? Holding much over 10K, call it 10.3, 10.5, much over that. There's not a lot of resistance up until 12. So that's the target I'd be looking at. If it starts to pop above that, be interesting. Man, imagine the FOMO that would create going from 10K to 12K here. Sheesh. Okay, let's go. BCH. Bitcoin Cash. Oh, my condolences, Bitcoin Cash. Yeah, again, has just been a big laggard lately. And, philosophical reasons aside, Bitcoin Cash has had some challenges, I think, for a lot of reasons, right? Because of, one, I mean, Bitcoin clearly is Bitcoin, regardless of what you think. The perception is Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash is not. And it's just been this long-term laggard for for quite some time. And then you've got the fake Satoshi, and he's got his drama, and just has some challenges, man. But that being said, is it tradable? Yeah, but I'm not too inclined to knife catch Bitcoin Cash here just yet. You are seeing a potential bullish divergence form, but it's only a potential because it needs to bounce after undercutting the most recent lows. RSI is starting to form higher. So if you start to see that happen, then yeah, maybe you get that bounce here. But on the 4-hour chart, I'd like to at least see it recapture some of those moving averages. Then that would really start to give a little bit more weight towards a potential, double bottom forming here on the daily chart. But until that happens, if I had to pick between BTC and Bitcoin Cash, I'm going BTC. See what else. OMG. You know which one was moving above range here recently was Theta. I was keeping an eye on this one because we talked about this one recently. If you go to the daily chart, again, another one that has multiple times attempted to break this long-term range. And this is going back to July of last year. And it finally is trying to poke above. It's pulling back right now. So it'd be interesting to see if Theta starts to hold right here. LBC, oh, that's a name from yesteryear. Man, I think Library was, if I have to recall, maybe the 4th or 5th altcoin that I actually owned, that I had bought. Apart from Bitcoin and Litecoin, I think Steam was one of them. Library, there was a handful of like old school alts that I was buying way back in the day. Man. But yeah, I remember they were emailing me and getting me on their stuff here. But oh, those were the days. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe something like Library would be awesome if it really started to take off in terms of censorship that's going on right now. And I'd love to see a real project kind of start to dominate. But from what I want to buy it here or trade it here, it's a tough call because it's already had a good move. Unless there's a big fundamental reason why this is going to continue. You're up 300-400% very quickly. At least wait for a little bit of a pause. That'd be my going in position, right? So at least maybe a pullback or some sideways action would be more ideal than kind of chasing it at this point. But if I was holding it, I mean, there's really, other than it being oversold or overbought and maybe profit taking, there's really not a whole lot to consider. It's got a long ways to go before it starts hitting next targets, right? So there you go. I mean, you've got, if it gets above here, then you're talking 880, and then above that, 1500. So let's see, BTC here, still doing its own, still holding up. Good stuff here. That short-term chart's looking interesting, though. I mean, the 1-hour chart was looking like, hey, is it top end here? But it's been a tough call here. I mean, for the most part, I've been sticking to the longer ones. The 4-hour view is probably the better one for me. BTC 10K tonight. Tonight, maybe in the next hour. Raven. Oh, Raven. Where's going on with Raven these days here? Man, so many of these alts are just cracking below the most recent support levels versus Bitcoin. I mean, they've dropped, and that was kind of the panic drop, and then they started to base out. It would have been so nice to start seeing some of these really start to bounce, but no dice. One thing that I'm always watching for, though, is that fake out reversal. It's usually a pretty nice setup, especially after a long drop. When you see it base out like this, and then it drops, and then it quickly gets right back above with volume, then that's typically not a bad setup there, because then you have your low. Oops, you have your low set up as your most recent swing low is kind of your max stop. Once it gets back above the line, that's usually my trigger. But until then, you just got to wait for those things to start happening. IOTA was trying to get going, and then of course got smacked as soon as Bitcoin starts to rally. A lot of these names are just still rolling over versus Bitcoin. That's just been the theme right now. Bitcoin. Resistance is interesting here. It's going to be an interesting juncture, though, because resistance is massive. I think there's a lot of people, maybe booking some gains here or potentially even shorting heavily into this level. It's going to be interesting to see if you get a short squeeze. pop over this level, or if it just turns out to be a bull trap, sucks in some longs and it dumps hard. I'm hedging, and so the way I hedge, there's one of two ways. I'll find a spot in the chart similar to like a trailing stop, and I'll use that as a short entry point, right? So I'm just gonna have an outstanding, a sell stop order. Won't necessarily go short, or excuse me, go flat on my long positions, but what I'll do is I'll have a corresponding short trade on margin that will start to offset it if we break a certain level, right? So that's one way to do it. The other way is if I see the short-term metrics get very extended near term, like say hourlies, 4 hours, all start to really get overextended, you kind of get that little parabolic move, I may just take some shorts into that and then just kind of scalp it on the way down. So a couple ways to hedge there. There's always flipping into alts. Maybe those finally start to bounce, but I'm gonna wait until we actually see a few more names show some life on the way up. Right now, not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. Even Binance Coin, Tron. I mean, there's potential that they start to bounce here, but just hasn't seen it. Not yet. Oh yeah, that's a good question. So when I hedge, so if you get filled, all right, so let's say I have a short trade order. Let's go to the hourlies, right? Let's say I have an order right here, right? 9,600 or something, or 9,550 or whatever you want to call it. If that gets filled and I'm short at that point, then I don't give it a whole lot of room to the upside. Usually I go with like the most recent swing high or the most recent candle high, because in my opinion is if it starts to drop here and I get filled, I want to see it continue lower, maybe bounce here and then drop some more, but I don't want to see it bounce all the way back up and fully retrace, because if that's the case, usually that's a fake out shakeout and then you'll get a breakout after that. So cut your losses is usually my approach. So that's the most I'd give it, right? So in this case, it'd be about 98.70 or so. I wouldn't give it to 10.5, no way. I just get out of the way and ride the next wave up, and then look for another entry there. Litecoin, yeah, Litecoin don't get much love these days. I think it's due for a bounce. I almost went long Litecoin right here when I saw this little double bottom forming. I was like, oh man, these guys are due for a bounce. Maybe I should go long Litecoin. But I just wanted to see it start holding above some moving averages on the BTC pair. I just never could. So I didn't convince myself too much to start longing it. But I think if it can finally hold above the moving average at least and go flat, then I'll start adding some. But for now, yeah, I'm just going to wait. Looks like it's a little bit of a reversal going on BTC here. Let's go to that 1 hour chart. Choppy woppy. Let's see here. Dump it. Let me go to the daily on the tracks. Yeah, I wouldn't argue against this one. It's been basing out pretty nice. Higher highs, higher lows starting to form. Potentially a little bit of a cup forming here. And it's right at some resistance here. If you look left, this has been a little bit of a range that if it can crack over, you've got a little bit of room to run, but it's basically retesting this level again, long time level. So getting over that would be pretty decent, but it's, can't argue with this one. Since September, it's slowly been grinding higher. Interesting juncture here. Yep, 1 hour BTC. All right. Reading the comments here. So I get it, right? The bullishness in Bitcoin in light of the macroeconomic picture. I totally understand, and I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, I'm holding Bitcoin, right? So I'm not bearish by any means, but when I tend to see the over bullishness that we've seen here recently in the halving, and we're going to 20K in May and 40K this summer and 100K by Christmas, and when I see that just non-stop for a week and there's nobody on the other side of that, I get cautious. I just start to make note of that. I've seen it too many times in this space where it's kind of like everyone jumps to one side of the ship, and more often than not, the majority of people are wrong on the trading side. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. But if this truly is the beginning of one of these 2017 style runs, this was uber bullish the whole way up. I mean, people were talking. I remember we were looking at 5K like, man, can you imagine if it ever hit 5K? And then it did. And then we were, what next? Can you imagine if it ever hit 10K? And then it did. And then it got stupid crazy. So, hey, could we be on the beginning of one of those? Maybe. We certainly could. But you guys know where I stand. I'd like to see a little bit of a pause, breather here, or some sideways, and then this scenario start to play out. Because longer term, then, yeah, I'm with you guys. I'm uber bullish longer term. I'm thinking there's more to go. And eventually we do see those 5 digits numbers. Will we see a 6-digit number? Maybe in a parabolic spike. I'm just not quite in the camp that we're going to go, through another one of those 1,000, 2,000% style moves, But hey, I'd be happy with 20, 30, 40K bit. I mean, who wouldn't? So, okay. Cool. All right, my friends. Well, that's time for me. Appreciate you guys being here on this weekly update. We'll see how it plays out here. Watch, as soon as I go off the stream, it's gonna break loose. It's gonna be charts bleeding all over the place. Ah! I hope not, but all right, my friends. Thanks for being here as always. Thanks for the likes, the thumbs ups, the subscribes. We'll see you all in the next one. Take care, everyone.